Your brain is not running on electricity. That's the first thing you need to understand, and it's the first thing almost everyone gets wrong. We've spent 70 years telling the public that brains are like computers, that neurons are wires, that the mind is electricity dancing through meat. It's completely backwards, and the confusion has cost us decades of real neuroscience. I know this sounds insane. Every textbook you've ever opened tells you the brain works by electrical signals. Neurons fire, synapses transmit, ion channels open and close, action potentials propagate, all of it electrical, right? All of it based on charges moving through space. You can measure the voltage, you can see it on an oscilloscope, it's real, it's there. So, how can I stand here and tell you it's not what's actually happening? Because electricity is not the engine, it's the spark plug, it's the messenger, it's the surface phenomenon. And if you mistake the messenger for the engine, you will never understand what the brain is actually doing, and you will never understand what consciousness is, and you will keep looking in the wrong place for 70 more years. Here's what's really going on. The brain evolved to run on chemical energy, on metabolic cycles, on the burning of glucose in mitochondria. That process is not electrical, it's thermodynamic. It's about the capture and release of energy stored in molecular bonds, the mitochondria inside your neurons, billions of them, trillions across your whole brain. They are tiny solar collectors. They take the products of photosynthesis that happened in plants millions of years ago, or in the ocean, or in bacteria, and they run the entire show. Everything you think, everything you feel, every memory, every dream, every moment of consciousness is powered by that ancient solar energy, repackaged and funneled through the machinery of metabolism. The electrical activity you can measure is real. The action potentials, the ion gradients, the voltage differences across the cell membrane, they are all there, but they are consequences of the metabolic process. They are effects, not causes. It's like watching a waterfall and thinking the sound is what's moving the water. The water is moving because of gravity and elevation. The sound is something the moving water creates. And neuroscience has been staring at the sound and wondering why it can't figure out what's causing the waterfall. I didn't always understand this myself. I'm a theoretical physicist. I spent my career thinking about black holes and quantum gravity and the holographic principle. I thought the brain was not my problem. Let the neuroscientists figure it out. They have the measurements, they have the labs, they have the tools. But about 15 years ago, I started getting interested in the question of quantum coherence in biological systems. How can quantum effects persist in warm, wet, noisy environments like cells? How can the brain maintain quantum states long enough for them to matter for consciousness? That's when I started really reading the neuroscience literature, and that's when I realized something was fundamentally wrong with how the whole field was thinking about the problem. The standard model in neuroscience is called the connectionist model, and it comes straight from computer science. The idea is that the brain is a network, neurons are nodes, synapses are connections, and consciousness emerges from the pattern of connections and the strength of synapses. It's an appealing model. It's easy to visualize. You can write equations for it. You can simulate it on a computer. And it has been the dominant framework for 40 years. But here's the problem. It doesn't explain consciousness. It doesn't explain subjective experience. It doesn't explain why you feel the redness of red or why pain hurts. It explains behavior. It explains learning and memory and pattern recognition. But consciousness? It keeps slipping away. Why? Because you are looking at the wrong level of description. You are looking at the network topology, the synaptic weights, the flow of information through circuits. All of that is real. All of that matters. But consciousness is not an emergent property of network topology. Consciousness is tied to the metabolic state of the system. It is tied to the moment-to-moment energy production and distribution in the brain. It is tied to the oscillations of neuronal activity that are synchronized to circadian rhythms, which are synchronized to the sun, which was the original source of that energy billions of years ago. Think about what a circadian rhythm actually is. Your body has a clock. Every cell has a clock. That clock ticks once per day, roughly 24 hours. It regulates your sleep, your temperature, your hormone levels, your immune function. If you disrupt that rhythm, you get sick, you go crazy, you can't think. And that clock is not electrical. It is not a circuit oscillating at a certain frequency. It is a biochemical oscillator, a cycle of gene expression and protein synthesis that is coupled to the light-dark cycle of the sun. It is, in the deepest sense, a resonance with the primary energy source of all life on Earth. Now, why would evolution do that? Why would the brain evolve to be so tightly coupled to the sun's daily rhythm if the brain were just running on electricity? If your brain were a computer, it wouldn't matter what time of day it was. A computer doesn't care about the sun, but your brain does. Every neuron cares. Every thought you have carries the fingerprint of solar time. That is not an accident. That is not a vestigial hangover from evolution. That is a fundamental design principle of the nervous system. Here is where it starts getting strange. When you measure electrical activity in the brain, when you record from an electrode placed inside a neuron, you are measuring the consequence of enormous flows of ions across the cell membrane, sodium in, potassium out, chloride shifting, calcium flooding through channels. All of that is driven by pumps. The sodium-potassium ATPase is the most abundant protein in your brain. It works 24 hours a day, pumping out 3 sodium ions and taking in 2 potassium ions, creating and maintaining the gradients that allow the electrical signals to happen. And what powers that pump? ATP. Adenosine triphosphate, the energy currency of the cell, made by mitochondria, which burned glucose, which came from photosynthesis. So the electrical signal, the thing you can measure, the thing that everyone says is how the brain works, is at its core powered by chemical energy that the cell has to constantly manufacture. The brain uses about 20% of your body's energy, even though it is only 2% of your body's mass. That is an enormous metabolic load. You have to eat, you have to sleep, you have to have circadian rhythms that keep your mitochondria running smoothly, because without that constant supply of chemical energy, the electrical signals stop. The brain goes dark. You lose consciousness. But here's what's important. The relationship is not one way. It is not as simple as energy being used to generate electricity the way coal is burned to generate electricity in a power plant. The electrical activity in the brain is also feeding back on the metabolic state. The ion gradients that the neurons maintain are not just used up in action potentials, they are also used to regulate gene expression, to control protein synthesis, to modulate the activity of enzymes and other cellular machinery. In other words, the electrical state and the metabolic state are locked together in a feedback loop. They are 2 descriptions of the same underlying process. I want to give you a concrete way to think about this. Imagine you are a mitochondrion. You are inside a neuron, and your job is to make ATP as fast as you can, because the cell is using it constantly to pump ions and maintain the electrical gradients. You are working at maximum capacity. Your electron transport chain is running, protons are flowing through ATP synthase, and you are cranking out ATP molecules. Now, as the cell's electrical activity changes, as the neuron fires, as synapses transmit signals, the rate at which ATP is being used changes. The cell signals to you that it needs more ATP. How? Through the concentration of ADP, through the ratio of ATP to ADP, through calcium levels. Your metabolic rate is constantly being modulated by the electrical state of the cell. They are not separate. They are 2 sides of the same coin. Now, I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I want to be honest about where this reasoning leads, because it takes you to a place that most neuroscientists are not comfortable going. If consciousness is not just an emergent property of network topology, but is tied to the metabolic state of the system, tied to the moment-to-moment energy production and the feedback between electrical activity and biochemical process, then consciousness is a thermodynamic phenomenon. It is about the flow of energy and information through the brain. It is about the rate at which the brain is doing work. It is about the efficiency of that work and the constraints on that efficiency. That sounds abstract, but it means something concrete. It means that consciousness is not infinitely scalable. You cannot add neurons indefinitely and expect consciousness to scale up linearly. You cannot simulate a brain on a computer without also simulating the thermodynamic constraints, the metabolic costs, the feedback loops between energy production and information processing. A digital simulation of a brain would be like a blueprint of a car. It might tell you the shape and the connections, but it would not tell you about the engine, the fuel, the heat dissipation, the actual physics of how the thing runs. Here is a thought experiment that I think clarifies this. Suppose we could map out every synapse in your brain, every connection, the strength of every connection, the exact state of every ion channel, the precise location and quantity of every neurotransmitter. We could, in principle, create a complete description of the brain at the level of electrical connectivity. Would that description be sufficient to recreate consciousness? Would uploading that information into a computer and running the simulation on fast hardware allow you to be conscious in the digital version? I think the answer is no. And the reason is that the description is incomplete. It is missing the metabolic part. It is missing the fact that the brain is a thermodynamic engine operating at the edge of its limits, with energy constraints that shape every aspect of its computation. A computer running the simulation would not have those constraints. It would not have mitochondria. It would not have circadian rhythms. It would not have fatigue, hunger, the need to sleep. The electrical network topology might be identical, but the thermodynamic context would be completely different. And I believe, and this is something I am still working through, something that does not yet have a clean answer, that the thermodynamic context is essential to consciousness. That consciousness requires not just the right connections, but the right metabolic furnace. The history of neuroscience is the history of looking in the wrong place for the wrong thing. In the 19th century, people thought consciousness came from the pineal gland. In the early 20th century, they thought it came from electrical fields sweeping across the brain. In the middle of the 20th century, they thought it came from synaptic transmission and network plasticity. In the late 20th century, they added computation to that. Consciousness emerges from complex information processing. All of these ideas have some truth in them. All of them identified something real about how the brain works, but none of them identified the fundamental engine. None of them recognize that the brain is, at its core, a thermodynamic system powered by solar energy, tied to the planetary rhythms that govern all life and operating under metabolic constraints that are as important as the electrical topology for determining what consciousness is and how it works. I had a conversation about this once with a young neuroscientist. This was about 12 years ago, and she was very smart, very well trained, and completely committed to the connectionist model. She said to me, but we can measure every electrical property of the brain. We have electrodes, we have imaging, we can see the activity. If consciousness is happening, it should be visible in that data. And I said to her, that's like saying, if consciousness is happening in the brain, it should be visible in a photograph of the brain. Of course, you can see activity in the electrical measurements. The activity is real, but you are looking at the consequences, not the causes. You are like someone studying a radio broadcast and trying to understand the news by measuring the electromagnetic waves. The information is in there, yes, but you need to know the encoding to extract it. The encoding here is metabolic. The currency is energy. The grammar is the rate at which energy flows through the system. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that changed how I thought about this whole thing. She said, if that's true, then the brain is not a computational device. It's an energy device that does computation. And I said, exactly. And that distinction is not trivial. That distinction explains why consciousness seems so tied to the body, why you can't think when you are hungry, why sleep deprivation destroys your mind, why emotions, which are fundamentally about the body's metabolic state, are so central to consciousness, why you can be the same person moment to moment only if your circadian rhythm is stable and your mitochondria are healthy. This leads to something that genuinely puzzles me, and I want to be honest about where my understanding breaks down. If consciousness is a thermodynamic phenomenon, a consequence of the rate and efficiency at which the brain processes energy and information, then consciousness should be quantifiable. There should be a measure of consciousness. There should be a number you can compute from the state of the system that tells you how conscious it is. We have measures of information in thermodynamics and physics, entropy, free energy, work, efficiency. These are well-defined quantities, but consciousness is not. We don't have a unit of consciousness. We don't have a metric. We don't know how to measure the consciousness of a sleeping person versus an awake person versus an animal versus a plant. We don't know if consciousness is a binary property. Either you have it or you don't, or if it is a spectrum. We don't know. That troubles me. For 50 years, I have been studying physical systems where the quantities are clean and defined. Black holes have entropy. Quantum systems have wave functions. Information has definable properties. But consciousness, if it is a real physical property, if it is tied to thermodynamics and energy flow, then it should have the same clarity. And it doesn't, not yet. Maybe consciousness cannot be fully captured by the quantities we already know about. Maybe we need a new quantity, a new way of measuring the state of a thermodynamic system that is self-referential, that includes the observer and the observed in the same description. Maybe consciousness is fundamentally about the system observing its own state, and that self-reference is what makes it irreducible to the standard thermodynamic quantities. Here's what I know for certain. The brain evolved under specific constraints. For billions of years, the only source of energy for nervous systems was the sun. Photosynthesis captured solar energy and stored it in chemical bonds. All the early brains, all the fish brains and amphibian brains and reptile brains ran on that energy, and they ran under the rhythms imposed by the sun. When mammals evolved, when primates evolved, when humans evolved, those constraints did not go away. We still use the same mitochondrial machinery that bacteria used 3 billion years ago. We still have circadian clocks that tick to the solar day. We still cannot escape the need to eat, to sleep, to live in synchrony with the planet's daily rotation. And then, in the last 100 years, humans invented electricity. We created artificial light. We created machines that generate power without photosynthesis. We created a world that runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without the rhythm of the sun. And what happened? We got depressed, we got fat, we got cancer, we got Alzheimer's, we got insomnia, we got every disease associated with circadian disruption. Why? Because our brains did not evolve for that world. Our consciousness is built on metabolic machinery that expects to be in sync with the sun. Artificial electricity can keep the neurons firing. It can keep you awake and alert and productive, but it cannot feed the mitochondria in the right way. It cannot satisfy the deep circadian need that is wired into your nervous system at every level. I want to be very clear about something here, because I know this could be misunderstood. I am not saying that electricity is bad. I am not saying that you should go live in a cave and wait for sunrise to think. I am not saying that modern neuroscience is useless or that the electrical measurements of the brain are meaningless. Electricity is a crucial level of description. The measurements are real and important, but they are not the whole story. And the fact that we have treated them as the whole story, the fact that we have built an entire framework of understanding consciousness on the electrical model and largely ignored the metabolic reality underneath it, is a major failure of intellectual honesty in the field. The worst part is that we knew better. We have known this for decades. When neuroscientists measure brain activity in their labs, they measure glucose uptake, they measure oxygen consumption, They measure mitochondrial function. They know that consciousness is sensitive to metabolic state. They know about circadian rhythms. They know that the brain cannot be understood without reference to the body. But the dominant mathematical and conceptual framework, the connectionist model, the idea of the brain as a computational network, that framework does not have room for these things. So neuroscientists exist in a kind of split consciousness themselves. In their experiments, they measure metabolism. In their theories, they ignore it. They have built a discipline that is systematically blind to its own most important facts. I have been in similar situations before in physics. I remember the debates with Stephen about black hole evaporation. I remember saying things that I later realized were wrong. I remember defending positions with all the conviction I could muster and then seeing evidence that contradicted me and having to actually change my mind. That is not pleasant. That is not easy. But it is the only way forward. And I think the field of neuroscience is at that moment now, not at this exact second, but in the next decade or so, the measurements are accumulating, the contradictions are becoming harder to ignore. Some researchers are starting to think about consciousness as a metabolic phenomenon, as an energy phenomenon, not just as an information processing phenomenon, and that is going to force a reckoning with the dominant model. Here is what that reckoning will look like. First, it will demand that we stop treating the connectionist model as a complete description of consciousness. Second, it will require that we build new mathematical tools to describe the coupling between electrical and metabolic processes. Third, it will force us to ask different questions about consciousness. Not how much information does the brain process, but how efficiently does the brain convert energy into information? Not how are synapses connected, but what is the thermodynamic cost of each thought? Not what neural correlates of consciousness can we find, but what is the metabolic signature of consciousness? Fourth, and this is where it gets genuinely revolutionary, it will require us to revise the fundamental laws of neuroscience. We have been operating under what I call the electrical axiom, the assumption that the electrical activity of neurons is the primary level of description for understanding how the brain works. Everything else, the metabolism, the circadian rhythms, the body state, is secondary. It is noise in the system. It is engineering details that do not affect the fundamental computation. But if consciousness is tied to thermodynamics, then the axiom is false. The electrical activity is still real and important, but it is a consequent, not the antecedent. The primary level of description is metabolic. The primary fact is that the brain is an engine for converting solar energy into thought and consciousness. The electrical fireworks are what that engine produces. This changes everything about how we should think about consciousness emerging in the universe. For the first time in 4 billion years, there is a species us that can potentially decouple consciousness from direct solar power. We can imagine uploading a mind to a computer, running it on electricity generated from fossil fuels or nuclear reactions or solar panels. We can imagine consciousness sustained by artificial means, without circadian rhythms, without a body, without the ancient metabolic machinery. And it is possible, I actually think it is possible in principle, that such an artificial consciousness could work. But it would not be the same as human consciousness. It would be something new, something that has broken the deep evolutionary bond between mind and sun. And that raises a question that I do not yet have an answer to, and that I think will define physics and philosophy for the next century. If consciousness can be sustained by different sources of energy, if consciousness is fundamentally about thermodynamic efficiency and information flow, then what is the nature of consciousness? Is it a property of any thermodynamic system that reaches a certain threshold of complexity? Is it unique to biological systems? Is it a property of the universe itself at the deepest level? These are not soft questions. These are not metaphysical hand-waving. These are concrete questions about the structure of physical law, about the relationship between information, energy, and awareness, I do not have those answers. I've spent the last 15 years thinking about them, and I do not have them. And I am deeply unsettled by that. I am unsettled in the way that a physicist is unsettled when he encounters something that does not fit into any of the categories he knows. And that unsettlement is not a bug, it is a feature. It is a sign that we are asking real questions, that we are at the boundary of what we understand, that there is genuine discovery to be made. So here is what I am asking you to do. Stop thinking of your brain as a computer. Stop thinking of consciousness as emerging from computational complexity. Start thinking of your brain as a furnace built by the sun billions of years ago that is still burning solar fuel, that is still tied to the daily cycle of that star, and that is conscious precisely because it has evolved to be exquisitely sensitive to the rate and rhythm of energy flow through its circuits. Start asking what your consciousness is doing when you are hungry, tired, depressed, or out of sync with the world. Start recognizing that your mind is not independent of your body, not independent of the sun, not independent of the deep time of evolution. And ask yourself, what does it mean that we have built a civilization that runs on electricity at night, that disrupts circadian rhythms, that poisons the soil so that photosynthesis fails, that heats the planet so that the seasonal cycles become unstable? We have created a world that is, at the deepest level, fighting against the thermodynamic basis of consciousness. We have made it harder for human brains to do what they evolved to do. And then we wonder why we are all depressed, anxious, asleep at the switch. That is not a failure of your brain. That is not a failure of individuals. That is a failure of civilization to understand what consciousness actually is and what it needs and what it has always needed. A failure to understand that the sun did not stop being important when we learned to make electricity. A failure to understand that your mind is not separate from the solar system. Your mind is part of the solar system. Your consciousness is, in the literal sense, powered by the sun, and your well-being depends on staying in sync with the light that made you.